They didn't negotiate, they took it. That single sentence explains more than any press conference. Publicly, this was sold as energy policy. Quietly, it was a raw display of executive power. The US president said on record, "We will take it," referring to Venezuelan oil exports, then followed with something even more revealing: he didn't have to consult with anybody. Not Congress, not the courts, not even the Attorney General. That detail matters more than it sounds. Here's the fact. On day one alone, the value of what was seized was estimated at $5.2 billion, an immediate transfer of foreign resources into U.S. custody. No negotiation window, no legislative delay. Now personalize this. Oil isn't abstract. It decides how much you pay for gas, for groceries, for road repairs, for rent. When decisions move this fast, their consequences hit your wallet long before anyone debates legality. But here's the part nobody explains. This wasn't about Venezuela first. It was about a vulnerability inside the United States itself. The core event looks simple on the surface. The United States moves to take control of Venezuelan oil exports, positioning itself as the primary handler of that supply. But that framing is incomplete by design. What's happening here isn't a one-off response to Venezuela. It's part of a larger pattern of bypassing traditional negotiation in favor of speed and control. Here's the fact. The executive branch didn't describe this as a sanction adjustment or a temporary measure. It was executed as direct custody over exports, with the U.S. to take the majority of Venezuelan exports while allowing limited volumes to flow to Europe and Asia. The sales process, the shipping, and the destination are all managed under U.S. oversight. Now step back. When a government moves this fast without consultation, it's usually reacting to pressure, not opportunity. And that pressure isn't diplomatic, it's structural. So ask the key question most coverage skips. If Venezuela was the problem, why does the solution look engineered around U.S. refineries, U.S. markets, and U.S. inflation? Because this isn't about punishment. It's about dependency. And once you see that dependency, the motive becomes impossible to ignore. Here's the claim that changes everything. This move wasn't optional. It was necessary. Fact. American refineries, especially in Texas, Louisiana, and along the Gulf Coast, were engineered decades ago to process heavy crude, not light shale, not substitutes, a very specific grade, the kind found in Venezuela. The text states these facilities were tuned 50 years ago for that feedstock, and without it, the system runs inefficiently. Another fact, U.S. refiners are described as very anxious to reintegrate Venezuelan crude. That word matters. Anxious isn't political language. It signals pressure inside the system. Now connect the dots. When refineries don't get the crude they're designed for, costs rise, output falls, maintenance increases, margins compress. Those inefficiencies don't stay inside refinery gates. They move outward into fuel prices, shipping costs, and inflation. Here's the inference, clearly separated. When a critical industrial system depends on a foreign input it no longer controls, policy stops being diplomatic and starts being mechanical. You don't negotiate with a missing part, you replace it. Now notice what's missing. There's no denial that U.S. infrastructure needs this oil, no alternative feedstock presented, no long-term workaround mentioned. The silence is the tell, because once you admit the system is dependent, the next move becomes predictable, and the next move is already underway. Once that dependency is acknowledged, escalation becomes inevitable, and it happens quietly, under technical language. Fact. The Department of Energy confirms the U.S. will take the majority of Venezuelan exports. Some barrels are allowed onto the global market, sold to Europe and Asia, but the bulk is routed through American control. The oil moves physically under U.S. custody. The sales are brokered by the U.S. The flow is managed by the U.S. And Now here's where this starts to resemble something older. Not sanctions, not aid, resource management by a dominant industrial power. Historically, this kind of arrangement appears during moments of systemic stress, when supply chains are too fragile to leave exposed. This is the part that should feel uncomfortable. What's being normalized here is not cooperation but custody. The idea that one country can openly manage another country's core export, justify it as stabilization, and move on. Notice how fast this becomes routine. No emergency vote, no prolonged debate, just execution. Oil moves, markets adjust, headlines fade. That's the escalation. When something extraordinary is implemented quickly enough, it stops feeling extraordinary at all. And once control over flow is established, control over pricing is never far behind. This is where the leverage starts to compound. Here's the second proof hit, and it's stronger than the first. Fact, the revenue from these oil sales is officially described as money that will go to Venezuela to help the country get back on its feet. That sounds cooperative, but another fact sits right next to it. The United States controls the sale, controls the transport, and controls the physical movement of the oil. Venezuela doesn't move the barrels. Venezuela doesn't negotiate the buyers. Venezuela doesn't manage the timing. That's the contradiction. The money is labeled Venezuelan, the power is not. This is where the story permanently changes shape. Because when one party controls the commodity and the transaction, the other party no longer has leverage. It doesn't matter what the balance sheet says, control beats ownership every time. Here's the inference, clearly separated. This arrangement effectively dollarizes Venezuelan oil under U.S. supervision. The current regime loses autonomous financial control while the system is framed as reconstruction. That's not aid, that's custodial management. Now notice what wasn't denied. There's no claim that Venezuela can redirect exports. No claim it can choose alternate partners. No claim it can independently monetize its largest asset. The silence confirms the structure. And here's the line that locks it in. When a country's primary export is managed by another government, sovereignty becomes symbolic. This isn't about punishment anymore. It's about replacement. And once a replacement system is installed, it rarely gets rolled back. Because the next phase isn't about oil revenue, it's about what that oil does to prices at home. Now the pressure starts stacking fast. Fact. The Department of Energy explicitly links Venezuelan heavy crude to asphalt production and to a new construction boom aimed at driving down asphalt prices. That's not a side effect, that's the goal. Roads, bridges, infrastructure all become cheaper when this feedstock returns. At the same time, the same oil feeds gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, pushing multiple price points down at once. Second fact, global oil markets are already unstable. The text describes unprecedented unrest in Iran with real risk of supply disruption. That's the external shock. Third fact, Venezuela is labeled a sleeping giant, once producing 3.5 million barrels a day, now far below that. If that capacity comes online too fast, it risks price shocks. Too slow, and volatility spikes. Here's the inference. These pressures collide at the same moment. Inflation at home, volatility abroad, idle capacity waiting to be unleashed. Control becomes the stabilizer. So the U.S. positions itself as the valve. Open it here, close it there, smooth the spikes, absorb the shocks, but systems under this much tension don't stay stable forever. Now the story stops being abstract and starts landing on you. Fact. Lower asphalt prices don't stay in spreadsheets. They show up in road projects, construction bids, repair schedules. When input costs fall, projects that were paused suddenly move forward. When fuel prices ease, shipping slows its price climb. Those are not political outcomes, they're lived ones. Here's the inference, clearly marked. This policy functions like a hidden subsidy. Not a check in the mail, but a structural discount built into energy and materials. You don't see it labeled, but you feel it when prices stop rising as fast as they were supposed to. This is why speed matters. When costs drop quietly, there's no moment to debate them. They just become the new normal. Now zoom out for a second. While this stabilizes prices for consumers, it also reshapes incentives. Construction firms benefit first. Infrastructure timelines accelerate. Inflation metrics soften. And that creates a feedback loop. When prices stabilize, urgency fades. When urgency fades, scrutiny fades. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because this is the point where big systems quietly lock in gains and the public only notices after the structure has changed. But the deeper story isn't about oil or asphalt, it's about how systems learn to bypass resistance entirely. And that mechanism is the real center of gravity here. Here's the systemic insight most coverage never reaches. Fact, this entire strategy works because leverage has replaced persuasion. The US isn't relying on votes, alliances, or moral arguments. It's relying on choke points, refining capacity, shipping control, currency settlement, grid demand. These aren't opinions, they're structural advantages. Now the mechanism. When one actor controls the bottlenecks, everyone else adjusts behavior automatically. Markets comply before politics does. Companies follow the path of least resistance. Governments adapt to whoever moves the fastest. This is why spectacle matters. Announcing "we will take it" isn't about bravado. It's a signal. It tells markets the rules have already changed. By the time critics react, oil is moving, prices are adjusting, and contracts are being written. Here's the unsettling inference. Systems like this don't need public approval to function. They only need momentum. Once enough capital, infrastructure, and logistics align, reversal becomes expensive and unlikely. This is why the strategy feels calm on the surface. No emergency language, no panic, just execution. And when power operates this quietly, it stops asking permission altogether, which raises the real question: where does this trajectory lead next? From here, the path splits, but neither direction is calm. Fact, one possible trajectory is expansion. Venezuelan production ramps up faster than expected. More barrels flow under US management. Volatility abroad is offset. Prices stay contained. Infrastructure costs keep easing. On paper it works. The system proves it can absorb shocks and smooth them out. But there's a second path, and it's just as plausible. Control breeds dependency. Dependency breeds fragility. If Venezuelan output becomes a core stabilizer, any disruption inside that system, political, technical, or logistical, carries amplified risk. When one valve controls too much pressure, failure doesn't leak. It bursts. Here's the inference, clearly separated. The more successful this strategy becomes, the harder it is to unwind. Markets begin to price it in. Contracts assume continuity. Alternatives are deferred because they're more expensive. Notice what's already forming. Speed, custody, centralized control. These aren't temporary tools. They're habits. And habits like this don't wait for crises to justify themselves. They create conditions where the next move feels inevitable. Because once a system proves it can take control without backlash, the temptation isn't to stop, it's to go further. And that next move may already be in motion. Here's the final insight that reframes everything. This story isn't about Venezuela. It's about how power moves when speed replaces consent. Fact, the US didn't just secure oil. It demonstrated that it can seize, root, price, and deploy a foreign resource to stabilize its own economy, lower domestic costs, and manage global risk, all before the debate ever catches up. The deeper pattern is this: when systems work, they justify themselves. Cheap asphalt becomes smoother roads. Stable fuel prices become political silence. Managed migration becomes budget relief. Each outcome reinforces the method that produced it. Here's the sentence that ties it together. Control over energy is no longer about supply, it's about tempo. Who moves first, who moves fastest, who forces adaptation. And once a government proves it can act at this velocity, it doesn't need to argue its case. It just creates a new baseline and lets everyone adjust. If you want to understand where energy, inflation, and power are heading next, this is the layer to watch. Follow and subscribe for the next breakdown, because this system doesn't stop here. It scales.